I moved into my new apartment, a quiet street, hoping for a fresh start. At first, everything seemed normal, a modest place with friendly faces. But there was one neighbor who never really blended in. From the moment I arrived, I noticed a man living in the apartment next door. I never saw him often, but his presence was hard to ignore. He was always there, at odd hours, peering from behind his curtains. I'd catch glimpses of his shadow in the hallway and sometimes see him standing by his window, as if he was always watching. It wasn't something I could easily explain. There was a feeling about him that was deeply unsettling. In the first few weeks, I started to notice strange things. I remember coming home late one night and hearing soft murmurs coming from his apartment. At first, I thought it was the hum of an old television or the creaks of an old building. But the sounds were too deliberate, almost like he was talking to someone or even to himself. One morning, I found a small note slipped under my door. It was typed, simple and chillingly vague, "I see you." I felt my heart race as I read it, wondering who would write such a thing. I asked around, but no one seemed to know anything about him or about the note. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I began to notice little changes in my apartment too. Items weren't exactly where I left them. A framed photo, a book I cherished. Small things that held personal meaning were moved ever so slightly. I started to believe that someone was entering my apartment when I wasn't around. As days turned into weeks, my anxiety grew. I started setting up a small camera in my living room, hoping to catch any intruder on film. At first, the footage was normal. Just the usual background noise and the occasional movement of the curtains in the breeze. But one night I reviewed the recording and froze. On the screen, in the dead of night, I saw a figure slowly approach my window. It wasn't a shadow but a person, my neighbor. I could barely make out his face in the dim light, but his eyes were fixed on me with a kind of intensity that I can't describe. I rewound the video over and over, trying to tell myself it was a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew I was being watched. I began hearing footsteps outside my door in the dead of night. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or perhaps a stray animal. But the sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic, like someone pacing slowly, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway made my heart pound. Every whisper of the wind felt like a warning. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a cold, rainy evening. I had just settled into bed when I heard a loud knock at my door. I froze. Who would knock so late at night? My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just a neighbor needing help, or maybe it was something far worse. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I peered through the peephole and saw nothing but darkness. I felt an overwhelming urge to hide, so I pulled the blankets over my head and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the knocking persisted, and then I heard it, a slow, scraping sound coming from the floor. I gathered the courage to slowly approach my door, each step feeling like it took an eternity. When I finally opened it, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, yet I felt the presence of someone lurking in the shadows. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling as I locked it. I sat there in the dark, listening to the rain pounding on the roof, trying to convince myself that everything was okay. But I knew deep down that it wasn't. I felt like I was being hunted. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I installed a small security camera facing the hallway, hoping to catch any unusual activity. That night, as I watched the live feed from my phone, I was horrified to see him again. My neighbor, slowly and deliberately walking down the hallway outside my door. I could see him through the slightly open door of his apartment. His movements were strange, almost robotic, as if he was performing some kind of ritual. He would pause for a moment, glance directly at my door, and then continue his slow, deliberate walk. It was as if he knew I was watching. My heart pounded, and I felt an icy chill run down my spine. I couldn't understand why he was doing this or what he hoped to achieve. The simple act of being watched turned into an obsession that invaded my every thought. I started feeling paranoid even in broad daylight, always glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking in the background. One night, I decided I couldn't live in constant fear anymore. I gathered my courage and resolved to confront him. I waited until midnight when the building was cloaked in darkness and silence. I stepped out into the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the cold, hard floor. As I reached his door, I hesitated. My hand trembled as I raised it to knock. Before I could, the door creaked open, and there he stood. I couldn't see his full face in the darkness, but the glint of his eyes was unmistakable. They were cold, unfeeling, and there was something almost unnatural about them. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could only stare at him, paralyzed by fear. Then, in a voice that was disturbingly calm, he said, "I've been waiting for you." My heart raced so fast it felt as if it might burst. I tried to back away, but my feet felt glued to the spot. The corridor felt unbearably small, the air thick with dread. His presence filled every inch of the space between us, and I knew in that instant that this was no ordinary man. He stepped forward slowly, and I could see a twisted smile forming on his face. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was caught in my throat. The world around me faded away until there was only the two of us in that dark, oppressive hallway. Just as I felt I might faint from fear, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out, plunging us into complete darkness. I could hear his footsteps, slower now, as if he was savoring every moment of my terror. I fumbled for my phone, its light barely piercing the black void. In that weak glow, I saw him looming closer. His face was partially illuminated, and I could see every disturbing detail. The pale, almost translucent skin, the deep hollows of his eyes, and the sinister smile that stretched too wide. In that moment, I realized that he wasn't just a strange neighbor, he was something far more sinister. I tried to move, to get away, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was trapped, paralyzed by a fear that was as real as the pounding of my heart. He reached out a hand, and I swear I felt a cold, clammy touch brush against my cheek. I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. When I opened them again, the hallway was empty. The only sound was the erratic beating of my own heart. I stood there for what felt like hours, shivering in the cold darkness, unsure if what I had experienced was real or just a nightmare. But deep down, I knew it was real. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to speak of what had happened the night before. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, a trick of the dark, an overactive imagination. But as the days passed, I began noticing more signs that I wasn't alone. I found strange marks on my door, like scratches that hadn't been there before. My belongings, which I had meticulously arranged, were subtly displaced. And then, one day while packing to move out, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was loading my moving van when I caught a glimpse of a reflection in the side mirror. Behind me in the back seat, I saw his silhouette. I spun around, but the van was empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching me, waiting for his moment to return. That night, as I lay in my new place, far away from that cursed building, I thought I was safe. But then I received a text message from an unknown number. The message was simple, just 3 words. "I never left."